wanted to thank you for coming for an extremely timely panel. I have to say this is the largest panel I've ever moderated here at Hudson. And we have a very large and I'm sure appreciative audience to match it. So again, thank you to all of you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to Hudson. I'm just going to make a few brief introductory remarks and we'll get right into our panel of experts. First of all, Ambassador Darren Bloom was not able to join us this afternoon. He extends his gratitude to you for attending and apologies for not being able to make it this afternoon. Again, the title of the panel is Venezuela on Fire. The Trump administration faces crisis in Latin America, and we'll be discussing a number of aspects of that. I want to introduce the panelists before we move on. Mr. Jose Cardenas, a former State Department official in the George W. Bush administration. Gustavo Coronel, former Transparency International representative to Venezuela, as well as many other a distinguished resume. John Polga Hesimovich is an assistant professor in political science at the U.S. Naval Academy. Thank you for being here. Professor Christopher Sabatini, an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. We welcome him, joining us from New York. Mr. Hector Chamis from the Center for Latin American Studies, the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Again, our panelists are all extraordinarily distinguished, and I look forward to sitting and learning about a very timely issue and trying to provoke different questions. And we'll see if we get a chance at the end to open it up to questions and answers. I'm sure many of you are apt to have some. So we'll see how the time works out. Oh, that reminds me. If you could, before we proceed, if you could all please turn off your phones. Or if not turned off, silence them, airport mode, however you'd like to handle it. But it'll be a little, it's tough for the live stream audience to hear the music blaring. So without further ado, why don't we begin? Mr. Cardenas, thank you.
Thank you, Lee, and thank you, of course, to Hudson Institute for convening such a distinguished panel of experts. I'm honored to be here with my colleagues. I'm sorry that Don Jaime is not here. I was hoping that I'll get a chance to see him. He's somebody whose writings over the years have had a great impact on my thinking about the region, how to think about the region and Latin American politics. What I thought I would do in my brief opening comments is basically, I wanted to look at some recommendations for U.S. policy. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote an article that elaborates on what these points are, but I think they still resonate today, even with all of the fast-changing, the fast pace of change in Venezuela. And if I was in a room with Trump administration officials thinking about U.S. policy towards Venezuela, I would highlight three major points that I think should guide and inform U.S. policy on Venezuela going forward. And the first point is I cannot emphasize enough the importance of multilateralism and bipartisanship in Washington. I think that those two reinforcing dynamics are crucial because what the other side is looking for is division on our side that they can exploit. What I'm talking about is the Maduro regime and its enablers. Its enablers in Moscow, in Beijing, Havana, and other capitals. And it is a tremendous signal to those around Maduro that there is a unity. This is not a bilateral conflict between Washington and Caracas. The European Union is involved. The Lima Group is involved. And it is important that the Trump administration maintain the multilateral approach and bipartisanship in Washington. The second point I would highlight is Venezuela today, in many ways, is like Chinatown, the mid-70s movie starring Jack Nicholson. Classic movie, but the point being in that everything that's going on the surface is not totally encapsulate everything that's going on behind the scenes. And what I'm getting at is that there is a tremendous amount of money that has been made by associates of the regime over the past 15 years. We're talking billions and billions of dollars. And what that has led to is a lot of money being spread about by these bolichicos or boliburguesas or whatever we want to call them. They are people who have made a lot of money doing business with the regime. And they are spreading out that money around Venezuela, trying to buy a comfortable landing. And as unfortunate enough as it is to say, a lot of that money has penetrated the opposition forces. So be very careful about everyone that we're dealing with. And the way that we deal with that is to remain committed to principles. And that is the restoration of the Constitution, rule of law, democracy in Venezuela. The third thing I would say is inclusive. We have to push for an inclusive transition. The transition which is coming, and we could talk about this more because in my opinion there is no way that the Maduro regime is going to be able to survive the onslaught of the pressure being brought upon it. But in the transition, we cannot find ourselves in a situation where some people take over that immediately exclude or turn on the people that lose power. And this is to say that not all people aligned with Chavismo are crooks. Some are human rights abusers. Now, those to me they have to be dealt with in a special way. But honest Chavistas, those who idealize a different Venezuela, a more inclusive Venezuela that at least Chavez paid rhetoric to, those people cannot feel left out, that somehow the transition means a return to the status quo ante of the 1990s before Chavez came to power. So those are the three things that I would say remain as guideposts for the Trump administration policy, U.S. policy on Venezuela.
That's terrific. Thanks very much, Mr. Cardenas. And I want to salute you. That's the first time I've ever heard a Chinatown reference here. We hear Godfather all the time. I've even heard Forrest Gump, but really that was fantastic. What I want to come back to later is you're talking about how to include different people. So we're going to want to get a clearer picture on who's in that opposition. So that was fantastic. Thanks very much for leading it off. Mr. Coronel, if you can follow up, please. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As you remember, after the Second World War, Charles de Gaulle faced a great challenge trying to restore order and national dignity to France, a country with 247 types of cheese. I believe the leader in Venezuela will need one politically taller than Charles de Gaulle to restore order and dignity, national dignity, to a country with 2,000 generals. I'm not going to go over the details of what has been a national tragedy during the last 20 years. We all know that already. I think it's sufficient to say that Venezuela is a country in material and a spiritual ruin, and particularly spiritual ruin. This is why I believe that in the next 5 years, Venezuela will face a great battle. It will be a battle for the soul of Venezuela. You know, Bolivar used to say that Colombia would be a university, Ecuador would be a convent, and Venezuela would always be a military barracks. I believe the challenge of the new Venezuelan leaders in this 21st century will be to prove Bolivar wrong, that we can be a nation with the rule of law over the rule of weapons, a civilized nation. As you know, civilized means civil, opposed to, if we wanted to signal a civilized nation in a different manner, we wouldn't say a militarization. We would say, we have to say civilization. And civilization is that, the prevalence of the civil over the military. I have a short shopping list here that I believe should be probably considered by the new leaders that will start on the day after one in Venezuela. The first thing they would have to do is to open the doors of Venezuela to the world, to recover as soon as possible the trust of the international community that has been lost. The leaders should talk to Venezuelan people with their hearts on their sleeves. No more unfulfilled promises, no more populism. They should minimize the involvement of the state in the national economy that has proven to be wrong, historically wrong. They should structure a new management model for the oil industry in Venezuela without the need for a state-owned oil company. State oil companies in Latin America, all of them have been total failures. They should shrink or limit, if not eliminate, which is probably politically not possible, they should shrink and minimize the role of the most parasitic institution we have had in Venezuela, which are the armed forces. We should restrict the first president to one term. The first president in Venezuela, he or she, will have to take very unpleasant decisions, and he or she should not be looking for re-election. They should probably create a national policy of the creation of citizens. Venezuela is a country with 32 million people and with few citizens. We should create citizens, and we should institute a national program for citizenship that cuts across political cycles. We should create civilian heroes. Venezuela has had too many heroes on horseback. And finally, Venezuela has to apply justice to the guilty. I mean, if we want to prevent violence and if we want to prevent revenge, we have to apply justice.
Thank you, Mr. Coronel. That was fantastic. And it is a very interesting laundry list of different things that people should be looking at as developments unfold. Thanks very much.
Okay.
Mr. Hasimovich, if you would please continue.
Thank you very much, Lee.
I'm sure I'm mangling your name anyway. Feel free to correct me. I'm here to learn.
Well, I was hoping that we would disagree on things and be able to generate a lot of debate that way. But so far, I agree with everything that our first two speakers have said.
We'll get to that shortly.
Yeah.
I'll make sure we disagree.
I want to disagree on some things.
Yeah.
You know, to add to Jose's first point about multilateralism and bipartisanship, with which I agree fully, something that I have noted recently and I think is very important for not just the United States, but the Venezuelan opposition, is to not only make a plan. It's not clear to me what kind of precisely the step-by-step process is right now with the plan, but to make backup plans and to coordinate. And it's that coordination that I see as failing right now. And I think that the place to start with that is is to figure out what the goal is. If it's to get rid of Nicolás Maduro, if it's to free and fair elections, which is one of the 3 talking points of Guaidó, if it's deeper redemocratization, what is that goal? And once you decide on what that goal is and you coordinate with opposition and the U.S. and the Lima Group and other countries and other forces, then you can develop that strategy. And so I'm not sure that everyone has the same goal, and as a result, I'm not sure that everyone's coordinated right now. And the most effective route to achieving what I think most of the world wants to achieve in Venezuela and wants for Venezuela is both sustained domestic and international pressure on the Maduro government, on the Maduro administration. And one without the other is almost destined to fail or to continue failing. We've seen examples of this recently. Carlos Vecchio, a little bit ago, a couple of weeks ago, said in an interview, there is no plan B for Venezuela. And on the same day, President Trump was interviewed and said, I have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D, right? That can be easily avoided by coordinating. Julio Borges, after the failed entry of humanitarian assistance on February 23rd, tweeted that the United States should basically invade. The next day, the Lima Group discussed this and said, they dismissed kind of out of hand the idea of any invasion. The Colombian government, yesterday, the day before yesterday, there was a news report that the Colombian government was involved in stopping some 200 exiled Venezuelan military members who wanted to enter the humanitarian aid by force, bring it across the border by force, right? That doesn't seem to me that reflects a great deal of strategic planning with international actors. So I think that coordination is going to be really key moving forward. The second thing, and again, I think that this speaks to Jose's third point, is that we have to stop thinking of this as just a Maduro problem, right? That replacing Maduro isn't going to change Venezuela, and that any transition necessarily must include moderate elements of Chavismo, right? And we must also entertain the prospect that even in free and fair elections, it is possible that a Chavista could win, right? And regardless of who takes power, based on this, they're gonna have a heck of a hard time governing, right? And so the investment that the international community in the United States makes in Venezuela has to go beyond replacing the government in power or having free and fair elections and go towards strengthening institutions, rebuilding PDVSA, and for me as someone who studies the Venezuelan military, really investing in oversight and depoliticization of the Fuerzas Armadas Nacionales Bolivarianos de Venezuela, right? The armed forces. And so that means, the reason for this is because Venezuela is approaching the status of a failed state. There are large swaths of the country that are not controlled by the government, where the government does not have a monopoly on the legitimate use of force. And that includes urban areas where colectivos and other armed groups hold sway, right? You can think of places in Petare and in Caracas and other cities in Valencia and now in Ciudad Bolivar and places like this, where the government doesn't hold sway, or many rural areas, especially in eastern Venezuela and the western border area with Colombia, where there are irregular armed groups, the ELN, FARC dissidents, bandas criminales, sindicatos in mining in eastern Venezuela, in addition to dissident factions of the armed forces that are engaged in narco-trafficking, contraband, other types of contraband smuggling, etc. So the military, the armed forces, is going to be a necessary actor in restoring the presence of the state in those areas. And so a big challenge I see is having Chavistas and opposition be involved in reconstituting the armed forces, in exercising oversight of that institution to bring the state back where it needs to be in Venezuela.
Wow, that was terrific. Thanks very much, John. I mean, it's a daunting picture, and one of the questions I'm going to want to come back to later is to hear from all of you and what are the priorities. You mentioned a few. You mentioned energy, getting that back in shape. Mr. Coronel has as well, and then there's the armed forces as well. So what's the order that things are done, or do they all have to be done at roughly the same time? Mr. Sabatini, if you would follow on, please.
Thanks, Lee, and thanks for the invitation. It's an honor to come down from New York for this. It's also an honor to be on a panel that mentions both Chinatown and cheese discussion, so I really appreciate that. It's never happened to me, actually.
Yeah, it's...
I'm going to make 3 points. The first is sort of why this moment is important. The second are the risks that are inherent in right now in the moment, and not criticisms, but the inherent risks. And the third is sort of a potential opportunity. The first is on the moment of convergence. What's remarkable about this moment was it provided an opportunity that has been lacking for a long time. That while the rest of the regional community watched this country slide over the course of 2 decades into authoritarianism, into failed state, into criminality, into a mafia state, I have to appreciate the wisdom of the opposition to take January 23rd as a moment to interpret the Constitution, put up new leadership, unify the opposition behind that new leadership, and use that as an opportunity for international recognition. Now, there are obviously a series of things that help make that happen. The first is the wholesale shift ideologically within the hemisphere. We no longer have the enablers and the Kirchners, or the PT, or other governments, although you do now have the enablers in Mexico, but that's a different issue. The second thing that made that happen is, of course, the Trump administration. The Obama administration could have potentially done more to tighten the noose around this government. It did implement a series of personal sanctions, but it didn't engage. And I think it's very important now that this is, as Jose said, it's both international and it's bipartisan. Yes, there's noise on either side, but the truth is there's a very broad consensus about what this policy is right now. Now, what I'm going to say now are not criticisms. I understand how difficult it is to make policy decisions in the stream of the moment, but they're more sort of pointing out what the inherent risks are. The first is that this roller coaster ride of, and I support the idea of, and I like to say it's a tough time to be a Democrat sometimes and giving a talk, because you have to say, Democrats so often want to hate everything Trump does, but this is a sound policy up until now, and it deserves to be supported. But there is an inherent risk here, this roller coaster ride of, wait, now's the moment. Okay, January 23rd, no, now the humanitarian assistance. No, now when he returns. And there's a certain risk of loss of patience that is inherent. And I appreciate that Elliot Abrams yesterday walked back the whole notion of, and so did Vice President Pence, of a military option. That's very important for a number of reasons. And I think it's time to climb to, Jose had tweeted once, maybe it's time we stop writing about this. And I agree, actually. I think it's, let's let them implement the policy. But the risk is an inherent loss of patience. The second is that throughout this, and I understand why, especially given Venezuela's history in 1958, why the call for the military. But understand, as everyone on the panel so far has said, this is a military that is both top-heavy, to say the least, but is also, it has more generals in it than all the NATO countries combined. Okay, I'm not joking. Wow. It's there's probably more employees as generals in the McDonald's there. But it is deeply corrupted. It has become a mafia state involved in extortion, narcotics extortion, illicit trafficking, all forms, and it's deeply embedded with Russian and Cuban interests in particular. Having them or allowing them to be a broker in a democratic transition is deeply risky, because both the Cubans and those 2,000 generals and everyone else are going to be looking to save their assets. That has an ETS at the end of it. And that's very important, because we may be vesting too much trust in this institution. The third mention is Russia and China, and they're deeply involved. There's a great article in the New York Times today about Russia weathering its society. But let's be honest, it's going to serve as a broker to preserve its own interest. It's in there deep, and it's going to do that. And we need to be careful not to look for an early, easy exit here, because there are bad actors involved. And then last is the mention, is what John also talked about, is this real risk of a scorched earth policy. This is already a failed state, not just around the edges, but at its core. But if the Maduro government comes apart like a cheap suit, then the real risk is this will be like the ones he wears, actually, more like the tracksuits Hugo Chavez used to wear. Then there's a real risk this will be a deeply failed state, just short flight from the United States. Last, failing a quick transition and a much-needed transition, there is an opportunity here, and I realize it's fraught with risks, which is the International Contact Group, which met in Montevideo. It's a group of European countries, some Latin American countries, unfortunately it does not include, for obvious reasons, Mexico and Bolivia, that is calling for fresh elections in Venezuela. That is an opportunity, but again, it's fraught with risks. It was rejected out of hand at first by the opposition, and I understand why. They have been sort of led down the garden path of promises of mediation that at best had no teeth and at worst allowed Maduro to consolidate power and divide the opposition further. But here is an opportunity because it could, if fully pursued, if provided with a timeline, if provided with the threat of genuine sanctions, and if overseen, it could provide that moment to do a lot of what Jose and John and Gustavo have said, is to restructure the military, restructure the economy, restructure the Supreme Court, and most of all, restructure the CNE, the Consejo Nacional Electoral, which is important because having elections under the current context would be an unmitigated disaster. So I hope that whenever that interim process happens, and I think the contact group could provide an opportunity, and again, we've seen this administration at first reject it for various obvious reasons, and now begin to at least consider it. I think that's an important option. Again, it's risky, I realize that, but this constant deadlock hasn't gotten us so far, and there is a real risk of both betting too much on the military and a scorched earth policy.
That's fascinating. Thanks very much. Yeah, well, definitely one of the things that we're going to want to come back to then is to talk about the military. I mean, if you're saying that there are foreign actors in there that have embedded interest, and you're saying that this is a top-heavy military, that seems like a very, very tricky thing to deal with. So that's fascinating. Thanks again. Mr. Shemis, if you would continue and end off this introductory round. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Lee, and well, a big hug to Jaime, who could not be here, and he's a good friend. Perhaps he's watching. This is, as you rightly pointed out, this is a large panel, and I happen to be the last. So, what is there left for me to say?
You can argue with everyone.
Something comes
Fights.
Pick a fight.
So, I've been in this position before. The name S. And,
You can defend Maduro.
right.
Yeah.
No, I'm not going to defend Maduro, but let me say a couple of things that a little bit. Some of the conversation here went around the day after the reconstruction and this and that, and fine, but I wouldn't want to jump the gun yet because we're not there yet, certainly. I do think it's been said here. I agree with John's point on the question of coordination. It's not only everybody saying different things, but they're tweeting different things, which is sort of, it's problematic. Important people are tweeting, nonstop, things. I don't think that's helpful. I think Maduro must go. Whatever happens after the departure of Maduro is a necessary condition for everything good that we may want to contribute to. It's not a sufficient condition, certainly, but in this, nothing by itself could be a sufficient condition in this very fluid and complicated situation. I am particularly puzzled by the fact that we haven't, in the debate, come to terms with the very nature of the animal that we have in front of us. And I've been trying to do so a number of times in my column in El País. The other day, a journalist asked me if I was obsessed with Venezuela. And I said, well, obsession. Let me tell you, this is the worst crisis, political, economic, social, humanitarian, security-wise, crisis of criminality that we've ever seen in the continent, for sure, in history. Maybe the American Civil War maybe was a worse humanitarian crisis, but I'm not sure. This is not a dictatorship. This is not Videla. This is not Pinochet. This is not apartheid. All those were political and ideological entities who understood very well that when the time came, they had to negotiate. And they did negotiate under much less pressure than Maduro is facing today. I always remember when the night of the plebiscite in Santiago, Pinochet wanted to deny the results, and the U.S. ambassador picked up the phone. And that worked. So in academia and journalism, there's been transitions, transitology, as Philip Schmitter used to say, still does. Transitology, the science of transition. No, this is a criminal organization in control of the state, period. Which is not willing to negotiate anything. And the proof we had it, I was in Cucuta, and we had the proof when the next day the vice president said, well, you have seen only a little piece of what we're capable of doing. And the massacre of the Pemones, the indigenous group in the border with Brazil, continued and continues. This is a criminal organization that is, on top of that, is absolutely fragmented. It has no core, no center. I played for some time with the metaphor of a resource war, a kind of problematic that belongs to phases of state formation and state deformation and state collapse in Africa. Warlords that control a particular natural resource. The control of the natural resource entails control of the territory. That entails a process of destatization, a loss of stateness, a loss of the capacity of the state to centralize political resources, monopolize the means of coercion, collect revenue, and so on and so forth. Well, that's a little bit, and of course that entails war. It's the warlords control the resource, control the war, fragment the political system and the state itself. This is a little bit what we're having, not a little bit, quite a bit is what we're having in Venezuela today. That criminal organization does not have a political center. There are warlords that control illegal mining, gold, that control oil smuggling. Oil is cheaper than water in Venezuela. It's easy to fill a tank, a truck, and drive it to Colombia. And, you make all the profit you can imagine in the world. And, of course, drugs. And of course, drugs. It's a market that operates on the basis of decentralization by definition. All of that has contributed big time to this process of dramatic political fragmentation. This is a regime that has produced no equivalent humanitarian tragedy without war and without any major natural disaster. It's 3.3 million Venezuelans overseas in the last year and a half. Some people talk about 4.5 if you count that people started to leave, way back when they were, there was no freedom of expression. There were, all kinds of coercion, Chavez first and Maduro later. We know that the only thing that can stop this is Maduro's departure from power. If by the end of the year, Maduro, there is 1.2 million in Colombia alone, which the Colombian government has done an incredible job in terms of receiving them, giving assistance to them, and it's absolutely admirable, but it won't last forever, obviously. We know that if Maduro is there in December, there's going to be another million or so of Venezuelans in Colombia. Getting rid of Maduro for Latin American countries and for the U.S. is not foreign policy, it's fiscal policy, it's health policy, it's internal security policy. It's as simple as that. This same journalist also asked me, apropos a column of mine, if I was proposing military intervention. Because I compared Kosovo and Bosnia to Venezuela. And I said, I'm proposing intervention, humanitarian intervention. World leaders need to answer a fundamental question. A truck with food and medicine being driven by civilians and accompanied by civilians didn't seem to work. The thugs, the FAEs, which are, inmates that are dressed with a uniform, right? Pranato is the term, were there at the border. And the so-called colectivos, which is nothing else than a gang of thugs that work for as part of this, criminal organization. They work for the government today, but they work for private profit tomorrow. They were there at the border. I had a chance to meet and talk the driver of that truck that you see all over on fire. He was beaten up and miraculously saved his life, and he was there, and you could tell that he miraculously saved his life. What does Venezuela belong to in terms of category of facts? Where are we? We're not in Pinochet, Videla. We're not even in Cuba, which is, you know, a totalitarian system, a single-party regime that has tremendous capacity to control its territory. Well, this doesn't have that control. Where does it belong to? And I dare to say that this belongs to a category of cases that we've seen in the world. It belongs to a category of cases like Bosnia and Kosovo. It's ethnic cleansing has just started with the Pemones. It's a totalitarian regime that is massacring people. It belongs to a category of cases of Stalin's Holodomor. The OAS report on crimes against humanity documented the use of food and medicine, and the control of food and medicine as a weaponization in this war of a state against the civilian population. We think how many million people is genocide? How many Stalin killed 20 million Ukrainians, right? The figures vary, starving them. Well, Venezuela will go. Will be in a famine very soon, and how many million constitutes? How many million dead people constitute a genocide? Not 20, but what? 1 million, 2 million, 3 million? Again, 3.3 million. There is the crime of forced displacement. That crime, all the exiles, all the exodus. There is an aggression that is used as a weapon, as an aggression to neighbor countries. The doors are wide open because that entails a burden for Colombia, a fiscal, security, and public health burden. There we go. And finally, Juan Guaidó on the bridge that Saturday night said this is a crime of extermination. Use those words that are in the Rome Statute as well. Well, these people are not willing to negotiate. They're not willing to leave power under any circumstances. We'll do what it takes to stay there, apparently, up to now. We don't know tomorrow, we don't know next month. But in the meantime, what do? I think we need to start looking at ways of getting the humanitarian aid into Venezuela. And I wonder if another episode of civilians driving the humanitarian aid will be tried. It will probably not be enough. And I say, well, that intervention will perhaps necessitate at least the intervention of the 600 or so military officers and police officers of Venezuela that are living in Colombia now because they have deserted Maduro. Well, there we have is certainly 2,000 generals versus 600, policemen and women. Maybe not enough, but I think we need to reset the questions that we formulate, and I think we need to start looking at the instruments, the international law. I've been reading over the last couple of weeks profusely on Bosnia and Kosovo, and I'm puzzled by the fact that yes, the responsibility to protect in order to be implemented via force requires the authorization of Security Council. The intervention in Bosnia and the intervention in Kosovo didn't have the authorization of the Security Council. It was unilaterally decided by the Clinton administration and NATO. It went ahead. A few months later, it accomplished peace, just in a few months. Nobody today would say that that intervention was illegal, that it was illegitimate, that it was unjustified, right? Well, we're going to walk soon, if we are not already there in that neighborhood. And we need to start, at least we don't have the answers because we're not asking, I believe, the right questions, and we are in the worst crisis we've ever seen in the hemisphere, and we're close to what, in my mind, constitutes not only a crime against humanity, which was already documented by a variety of people, but possibly a genocide, at least as a procedure. And then we have to do the math. But of course, the definition of genocide is not about the numbers. It's not about the math. And I think, this is more serious than anything we ever saw in the region. Thank you. Sorry for my...
I was just looking to reset. And you did reset the questions. I'm very glad, actually, as it turns out, the alphabet worked to the advantage of the panel. Because you actually did change the picture of what we're talking about here. Because some of the conversation is about, well, we need to rebuild institutions, including the military. The military is a problematic institution. There are these different issues. But the question I come away with after what you said is, what is there? You're saying it's an organized criminal operation. You're saying there's no political center. So if you're talking about how we get this straight, and if we're talking about how there's multilateral cooperation on the international level and bipartisan cooperation here on the national level in this city, what is the picture? What is America looking at? Again, it's a very dark picture, actually. And if that's what it is, then we should get a pretty good idea of that. If there's no political center, if it's about organized crime, and if it's in the middle of an enormous humanitarian crime, that's what we're looking at. So if I can ask you then, so I'll just turn it around right on you. How does this unfold in the next few weeks, in the next few months? Then also to add on to that, I'll say, do you think the Trump administration, do you think the international community has that picture of it? Or what are they looking at regarding Venezuela?
Quickly, I don't want to monopolize. I think that...
No, you started off,
I think that's
the same basically to everyone.
And this is not me saying in the spirit of bipartisanship. Boston Globe wrote an editorial 3-4 weeks ago praising Trump's leadership on Venezuela. And so there you have, as much bipartisanship as you can possibly get. And I agree with that. And the multilateralism as well. I think I worry that the Venezuela issue is getting politicized vis-a-vis 2020, on both sides of the aisle, by the way. I think that it's absolutely reprehensible that many in the Democratic leadership cannot call Maduro a dictator. I mean, not even when an American journalist disappeared for about 12 hours and nobody knew where he was. What else do we need to call that a dictatorship? I think the international scene gives me more hope than it ever was. Somebody mentioned that we never had an international scene as propitious as we have it now. Almost 60 countries recognizing Guaido. None of them will recognize Maduro again. The question of sanctions, it's unfortunate what Michelle Bachelet said the other day, that sanctions to PDVSA are 2-3 weeks long. The worst sanction Venezuela has had is Maduro himself. I think we need to continue working in a multilateral and bipartisan way in Washington, multilateral in the way, and the Latin American countries. The Lima Group should act upon what they wrote. Last May, they wrote about sanctions to the Maduro cronies. They haven't implemented one of them. And so...
Let me, if I may, the Trump administration, of course, is wary of foreign adventures, especially the Middle East, coming out of many years in the Middle East. And this is different because it's in the Western Hemisphere. But nonetheless, if we're talking about the different, what exactly does the United States need to do? Because you're painting a picture where it's not just, where it's not just Elliot Abrams who's going down there and talking with people and getting everyone on board. You're talking about it sounds what you're describing, and it sounds like what many of you are describing, and I'll open up to all of you, but it sounds like we're talking about a real state-building project. And there is resistance to this in the United States. Again, this is the Western Hemisphere. It's not Iraq. It's not Afghanistan. What does that state-building project look like? If you would...
Well, Lee, if I can take the liberty of maybe synthesizing some of the comments that I've heard, is that, to crystallize it, is that it may very well be that pushing Maduro out is going to be the easy part, based on what is going to be necessary to root out the criminal state, which Hector and the others have mentioned. And speaking about the armed forces, and I think John mentioned this, is how penetrated the armed forces are, even by these irregular groups, because the Maduro regime does not trust the regular armed forces, and so has seeded the regular army with some of these paramilitary elements, these nothing more than gangs. So there is going to be an immense, not only, of course, we all can see it with our own eyes, a tremendous economic reconstruction challenge, but a public security one. The United States, and I agree with you, Lee, especially under this administration, we're not looking for more foreign commitments. But the fact that this is a country so close to the United States that I can see a very, very targeted campaign, not only, of course, in rallying the IFIs, the international financial institutions, to help the Venezuelans recover some semblance of a functioning economy, but the United States alone, and even the Colombians, who have this 30-year experience in combating the infiltration of the narcotics trafficking syndicates within their country, to shut them down, cut off the money flows, and otherwise develop a recovering sovereignty for the state within the whole expanse of the territory. So it's going to be a huge economic, but when I say a public security effort, I think it's going to be in the realm of technical assistance to Venezuelans, to help them, and Colombians to help the Venezuelans.
John, were you going to? Yeah, please.
Yeah. I think that the how is, everyone here seems to have insight on the how. I just wanted to add the why, which is that rebuilding the Venezuelan state is in the U.S.'s best interest and in the international community's best interest. Venezuela is already, a global narco-trafficking hub, and rebuilding the state and state sovereignty and security capacity is going to be instrumental in fighting that narco-trafficking. It also is increasingly a hub for terrorist groups, for guerrilla groups based, I guess, in Colombia, but now based in Venezuela as well. And I think that the U.S. doesn't want Libya in this hemisphere. And so I think that justification, to me, is very clear.
No, that totally makes sense, and that's very nicely put. I guess you made the analogy to Libya, and it sort of opens things up. Like, so what is Libya? Libya is a country with it's a place with a capital and a flag, and a whole bunch of people, and a seat at the UN, and a whole bunch of people who are fighting. But what's underneath there? What is the state, Mr. Shemitz?
No, and that's a great point, because it is already looking like Libya. And it could get, a lot more similar to Libya.
Right. Mr. Coronel, did you want to?
Well, I believe it's convenient to say that Maduro, as I say in death row, is dead man walking. Maduro has no chance of surviving this year of 2019, and most probably it will go the way of an implosion. The combination of external and internal pressures on the Maduro government is so great at this point in time that there is no way I can see his survival beyond the next 3 to 6 months, say. So my only concern is that as time goes by, the probabilities of the other scenario, which I find more likely, which is some kind of military intervention by the United States, might become greater. Right now, it seems to be small, maybe 50.
I'm sorry, because Maduro, because he seems to be holding on for a bit, that will increase the likelihood of the United States taking some sort of military.
Yeah, right now it's small because most Latin American countries seem to be very opposed. Right. Even the European Union has opposed any military intervention. But what I see here is that there is a very close interlinking between the Venezuelan crisis and the developing domestic problem in the political problem in the United States. I believe that there is a chance that as President Trump gets into deeper and hotter political waters, he might resort to some kind of military intervention in Venezuela as a means of gaining goodwill. And that's my concern. But I do believe that the Maduro government has no chance to, and when I say Maduro government, I want to emphasize the Chavista government, because there is a tendency to separate now Maduro from Chavez. Don't fall into this trap, because Chavez is the origin of all the whatever came after Chavez, Maduro. Chavez is the real culprit of what has taken place in Venezuela.
Chris, were you going to?
Well, first of all, I do think we risk believing that Maduro's days are numbered. I hope they are. But I remember a joke that was circulating back in the George W. Bush days that he falls into a coma and wakes up 20 years later, and he says, whatever happened to that guy Putin? He says, oh, he's gone. Whatever happened to Fidel Castro? He died. Whatever happened to Kim Jong-il? Oh, no, he died. He said, whatever happened to Chavez? Chavez, he's still there, but I hear he's going to be leaving soon. You know, and they say one of the shortest fingers you can have is one that sort of is always saying he's leaving soon. So I think we need to plan for the long term and not always, again, that patience issue is important. Two quick things. The first, actually three. The first is that remember that Kosovo and Bosnia-Herzegovina had, there was a parallel negotiation process headed by two individuals. So there was also a process of negotiation with Slobodan Milosevic and resulted in the Dayton Accords. It was not just military action, okay, even sanctioned by NATO. The second issue is, and of course it was backed by threats and real military action. The second issue is several have implied, and I'll just go ahead and say it, the UN on this issue has been pathetic on everything. I mean, whether it's the UN High Commission for Human Rights, whether it's Gutierrez on issues of humanitarian assistance, it really is abysmal. I mean, it is, as Hector said, one of the worst crises, not just in the hemisphere, but in the world. And they have been asleep at the switch or even obstructionist. So I think it's time, and this goes to the point, we are seeing, and I can frame this in a larger, for all of the criticism of the Trump administration of multilateral institutions, this is why. And now we're seeing the benefits of actually ad hoc multilateralism in this hemisphere, which is very important, which brings me to the last point. I do think, you ask what can the United States do? One thing is, first of all, it needs to pressure the other members of the group and the EU to begin to implement sanctions. They haven't done it, they've promised it. And you know, people say, well, the money isn't in sort of Argentine banks, it isn't necessarily, it doesn't matter. This is an administration, you start to yank visas, you start to kick out ambassadors. This is an administration, for all of its buffoonery, does actually care about its international reputation. It really does. And so you start to imply the pressure that way, and also freeze bank accounts. And last, the U.S. and the Lima Group needs to convene a donors conference. This has not happened. A donors conference that talks about humanitarian assistance to lead where the UN is not leading and starts to talk about and starts to get contributions. By this time in Syria, for example, I know a country you know well and have written about, Lee, there was already donors conferences, there already is a plan in action. That hasn't happened, in part, and I'm not blaming the administration because it's pursued more of a Guaido channel. I think Guaido should attend, but I think it's necessary to begin to put dollars behind some sort of multilateral effort to promise the day after.
Is the energy sector a problem or an advantage in that way regarding, I mean, both regarding a donors conference and just generally? Chris?
I'm going to defer to Gustavo, who's actually worked in the energy sector here. But I think I think it's separate. It will take a while. We were talking about this earlier. It's going to take years before the energy sector, the oil sector, actually recovers to where it was before. So I think the international community needs to start to pony up some cash. And it can start doing this by recovered assets. There's experience of doing this in Peru post-Fujimori and Montesinos, where they recovered a lot of the ill-gotten gains. There's a lot of money out there that can just be plowed right back in when put into far more responsible hands, which doesn't include the UN.
Just very quickly, Chris, before I move on, because I want to ask you, to what extent does the Russian and Cuban and Chinese presence pose a problem for the United States and for donor conference and for the UN, which you rightly criticize? Is that a real problem, or is that a separate track that we have to work, that this administration needs to work through?
It is both. I think that blocks any sort of Security Council, serious Security Council debate. So we can't, but the UN could be doing far more. That's not an excuse for the lack of action by the UN. On the other hand, again, if you begin to rally China and Russia for all of their rogue nation status and their nefarious activities, do care about what the European Union does, do care about what Latin America does. If you begin to build this broad-based coalition to apply sanctions, to think about you may begin to move the needle in this way. So it's more than just a group of, and I don't mean to belittle this at all. It isn't just a group of nations on the sidelines cheerleading for Guaido to become president. And I appreciate the cheerleading, and I appreciate long overdue. I appreciate them opening up their doors and recognizing them. But I think some real money and action has to be put in place.
Okay. Gustavo, if I can ask you then, we can talk about PDVSA. I mean, is this going to be a problem? What is the advantage of having an enormously significant energy sector? Or will this be a disadvantage? Is this one of the reasons why we have what Hector was talking about in terms of criminal enterprises, why people are all looking at the same thing and using the same thing? So, yeah, if you can give us some of the math on that, what are the upsides and what are the downsides with that?
Yes, well, as you know, Venezuela has called the highest oil reserves in the world. But very few are aware that most of this oil is a very heavy, low-quality oil in the Orinoco area. The Orinoco area has something like 300 billion barrels of oil, and that goes far more than what the window of opportunity for oil remains in the planet. I think most energy experts agree that in 50 or 60 more years, most of the energy will be coming from renewable sources of energy or cleaner fossil fuels like natural gas, but certainly not from heavy oils like the ones in Orinoco. So the problem is that most of this Orinoco oil will be left in the ground forever. We cannot count on that. Furthermore, the oil industry in Venezuela is totally dismantled, and it will take at least 4 to 5 years before the Venezuelan oil industry can recover, and that's in the best of cases, actually, because it's really in very bad shape. So I don't see Venezuela any longer as a petrostate, as an main oil exporter. It will be a medium-sized, maybe no more than 3 million barrels per day. It will never be a 5 million or more barrels per day oil producer.
John, I saw that you want to.
Well,
I'll come back to you.
I just had a reaction to that, simply that, very famous Venezuelans from Arturo Uslar Pietri in 1936 said, Venezuela tiene que sembrar el petróleo. It has to plant the oil, and the country hasn't done so. You later have, one of the co-founders of OPEC who says, oil is the devil's excrement, and will be the ruin of Venezuela. And an additional challenge to rebuilding PDVSA and to the fact that the time horizon of the usefulness of oil to Venezuela's economy, an additional challenge is, what does the Venezuelan government, whoever that government's going to be, decide to do with oil rents? How is it going to use that oil rent? Because that's been a contentious issue, not just under Chavismo, but back into the Fourth Republic and before.
Interesting. Jose, did you?
Yeah, Lee, I wanted just to make a couple of comments of going back to the enablers. What we see is the unhelpful role of Russia, China, and even Cuba. I think that even their support for Maduro is not without risks.
Yeah.
And I think that U.S. can exacerbate those risks through very strong information programs, public diplomacy. And what I mean by that is that not only just talking about their investments, meaning Russia and China, they of course want their investments back, but also the costs to their reputation. In other words, a country like China is very, very sensitive about its reputation in the so-called developing world. It wants to be seen as a positive, welcome partner for development throughout Africa, throughout Latin America. And the more that they can be, the more that their unhelpful role in Venezuela is highlighted, the more concerned for Beijing, that it's costing them. And for Cuba, Cuba has no investments to recover, but of course they do get the discounted oil. But in the same way, Cuba relies on solidarity with Latin America to resist what they see as the overbearing pressure from the United States through the embargo and other policies. So to the same extent, Cuba to be continuously identified with the humanitarian disaster in Venezuela, it costs their image. And that is something that they carefully have cultivated in Latin America for the last 60 years.
Interesting. Hector,
Yeah, if I may comment on three separate points, I agree with this issue of China and even Russia. Nobody appears to be willing to be on the photo anymore with them, which is a good sign, right? I think it was Delcy Rodriguez was in Moscow recently, and a second level official of the Russian government. President Putin was busy at the time, which is it reinforces the point Jose just made, and the same about China. Regarding Cuba, well, that's the other point that we haven't talked, where a good chunk of the negotiation should be there, right? There are still 22,000 military officers in Venezuela, and the Cubans, it's been documented, the Cubans control all the information, civil information, voting registration, passports, cédulas de identidad, IDs, and so on and so forth. And well, so a good part of this, negotiation - pressure should be taking place in Havana, not necessarily here. Another point I wanted to comment is that in this complicated oil equation for Venezuela, something new happened in the last few years, which is the U.S. is a big producer of oil, which is relatively new. And about the UN, I agree with Chris, but I want to highlight a point, which is important. In June last year, the previous High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Said, wrote a devastating report about Venezuela, which included an appeal to the International Criminal Court to intervene in the matter because, and I quote, because I've read it enough times, there doesn't appear to be the willingness or the capacity to offer justice to the Venezuelan citizens, right? Which is a complementarity issue in legal terms, and that should be, Commissioner Bachelet cannot go there on a fishing expedition. I mean, or her people apparently will go. They have to go with the report that office produced just last June. Institutional continuity, it's called.
I was going to ask you, I want to ask all of you, but I just want to follow up with Hector on one thing. You mentioned that we hadn't brought up the Cubans much. So let me ask, to what extent does Venezuela decide the geopolitical picture in the Western Hemisphere, right? Like, how decisive is this if, who was it? John, I think you mentioned Christina before. So what are the things we're looking at? How important is Venezuela right now for the balance of the region? Why, Hector, I was asking, I was following up with you on the Cuba stuff, but please, it's open to...
Christina, you mean Christina Kirchner?
No, not, yes, but it's not about her in particular. I just want to know how Venezuela, is this a decisive piece of the geopolitical layout of the region?
The ALBA politics has seen better days. I would say it's on its way out as an understanding of international relations of the hemisphere, and of course it required oil at $140 a barrel, right? Which is no longer the case. What I think is central regarding the Venezuelan case is the lesson, the moral of that story for the rest, whether it ends or not, whether it stays, whether time continues and it does become Cuba with only one party, one legislature, which is the fraudulent Asamblea Constituyente, which was fraudulently elected. And then the two different outcomes there. And I'm putting it in terms of polar outcomes, even if things will be more or less in the middle probably. But a democratization of Venezuela is a very powerful moral and a lesson for the rest of the continent. To save democracy as the only legitimate form of political order in the region.
John, you want to? Yeah, please.
I mean, the short answer is yes.
Okay.
Right? Venezuela is key, right? Half of China's $130 billion of loans to Latin America was to Venezuela under Chavismo or Madurismo. So China has a stake in Venezuela that doesn't have in other countries in the region, right? Russia's geopolitical interests in Latin America seem to be centered on Venezuela as well, right? That doesn't even speak to Cuba, which depends, its entire energy sector depends on Venezuelan crude, right? And I think that the relationship between Cuba and Venezuela is different now than it was during when Chavez was alive, right? You had this father-son relationship between Fidel and Chavez that evolved into something different as Chavez died. With Maduro, that's changed. And now under the new leader in Cuba, this is a transactional relationship between the two countries. And Cuba is going to do anything in its power to keep Maduro where he is. Because otherwise, if there's a change in government, a change in leadership, even within Chavismo, that could spell the end of
really. So you think like if Venezuela goes the other way, then it's going to hit Cuba eventually or soon?
Immediately.
Really?
Immediately, with the amount of oil that Venezuela sends, preferential rates, very preferential rates to the island.
If I could make another point about the strategic geopolitical situation with Russia, China, and Venezuela, is that in the strategic competition that those countries perceive they are in with the United States, Venezuela offers them an opportunity to basically cause trouble close to our borders.
Right.
They resent, as we know, of course, Moscow resents the United States presence in the former Eastern Europe and getting a little bit too close, support in Ukraine, things of that nature. China, we all know, we're in a test of wills in the South China Sea over freedom of navigation. We are tied intimately to countries, Japan, South Korea, so which Beijing finds obviously an affront to their great power status. And so I think that they also see an opportunity in Venezuela to give Washington a dose of their own medicine in their
Platform too, right.
in their perspective.
Gustav, I'm sorry, I had cut you off before. I wanted to come back and yes.
Yes, well, I believe that North China or Russia will go to war on Venezuela. Right. China, of course, has priorities bigger than Venezuela vis-a-vis the United States. And Russia, they have their own domestic problems. I feel that the main arena for where the Venezuelan battle is being fought today is in the region. And it has to do with the battle between the non-intervention policy and the democratic charter policy, which are apparently of equal value within the OAS, but historically the non-intervention has prevailed over the defense of democracy in the region. I think this time the United States is on the right side of the fight. They are for the defense of democracy rather than for non-intervention.
Chris?
I'd just like to quickly disagree with my friend John here about the effects of Cuba. Well, it would definitely put a dent in their economy. We'll get a little alarm rustle later. This is a regime that after the collapse of the Soviet Union went through the euphemistically called special period where its economy contracted by 35%. They're willing to inflict any pain on their population to stay in power. So I wouldn't expect a reverse domino effect. I would hope so. Right. But I wouldn't expect it to be immediate.
Okay. Do you see it having an effect though in the hemisphere? Let's say it's hard to imagine because there are different scenarios, which is what we've been discussing. What are the different scenarios that would affect other things in the hemisphere? I mean, if not to flip the whole thing over, but what are the different?
I think, first of all, being somewhat of a glass half full sort of guy, I think we can talk about, it's funny you think about 15 years ago, people feared that Chavismo was going to sweep the hemisphere. Now, the Bolivarian Revolution is only an example for the most deluded. And at the same time, of course, it also led to the collapse, thankfully, of these misguided efforts of regionalism, such as UNISOR. Its building is now vacant. It's actually open for rent for bar mitzvahs and birthdays free. So it's actually, there's been a sort of a cleansing process. Now, I think we are seeing, as Gustavo said, this non-interventionist feel in Mexico. And I think that will be, but I think to the extent that this will change the hemisphere, I think it's going to be in some ways positive. If Venezuela, if there is a peaceful transition in Venezuela, despite all the risks and difficulties in and challenges, better put, in reconstructing it, we will see a weakened Cuba, we will see a weakened Nicaragua, and we will see less of a desire of the bloc of Caribbean countries to put their financial interest above principle. Which is what they've been doing for the last 20 years.
I'm sorry, Hector, but I want you to follow up after.
I agree for the most part of the special period and everything. I think also Venezuela is important for Havana because it's sort of the front man, right? And without it, there is something at stake in Latin American politics in general, which is the Cuban narrative that continues to be played and sold and repeated, and it's the land of liberty with a single-party regime and a dynasty of two brothers for 60 years. But yeah, it's a narrative that gets repeated itself, and I think the survival of Maduro or not, the survival of this regime or not, will have implications over the capacity of that system, the Cuban regime, to continue selling this, narrative.
Jose, did you?
I would just finally add on that I think that what happens in Venezuela almost determines the applicability, the relevance of the UN. The Inter-American Democratic Charter. This was unfortunately, only those of us who follow Latin America on a continuous basis seem to recognize how important, how historical this document was. It was signed in 2001, and it basically commits the entire hemisphere to a democratic system of government. Now, its relevance we continue to struggle to keep building it up and investing the importance that the document inherently has. If we lose Venezuela into some sort of ongoing authoritarian criminal state, it really harms the validity of the Inter-American and applicability. If we can get through this peacefully and reset Venezuela on a course to democratic constitutional government, then I think the Inter-American Democratic Charter is vindicated and is strengthened. So I, for one, who have always been very, very enamored or supportive of the Inter-American Democratic Charter, I think almost its validity is hanging in the balance as well.
Agree.
Why don't I open it up? Are there any questions? Do you have any questions from the audience?
I forget the clock. That's surprised that was before.
We have 10 minutes. So I'm going to ask then the people, this gentleman, I'm going to ask for you actually to ask a question. Let's reserve the statements for later. So just get out your question and we'll get some answers from our panel here.
Okay, maybe make.
You could identify yourself, please.
Yes, Duke Banks Romero. I'm Venezuelan American.
Okay.
I want to pick up on this theme about multilateralism, which I agree with. But at the same time, I think you guys just touched on it, the fact that a lot of the Caribbean countries are not, have their financial interest.
I'm going to ask you in the interest of time if you can phrase it as a question so we can get it out.
What can we do to bring the Caribbean countries in to multilateralism so that effectively support OAS, Luis Amargo, and effectively, as Jose mentioned, help the Democratic Charter?
Jose, do you want to give that one?
Well, that has been a particular bane in efforts, especially at the OAS, as you know, trying to unite member states of the OAS behind actions to defend Venezuela democracy. Some ascribe it to the fact that these countries were once beneficiaries of preferential oil deals through Petrocaribe by Hugo Chavez, which of course today are practically nil. It's an unusual to see these countries. I'll have to admit, these countries that have long-standing democratic traditions, these Caribbean states, that they have turned their backs on the Inter-American Democratic Charter in supporting and defending what's going on in Venezuela. It's been a very unfortunate. What can we do? Well, I think that moral suasion and shaming them, frankly. I don't want to see a case where the United States will, these countries have enough of their own problems with the United States somehow bringing economic pressure on them to do the right thing. I think that what we're left to do is basically moral suasion and hope that that over time they will realize that they made a bad bet on Venezuela, and we'll welcome them back into the fold to do the right thing.
Thanks. Let's take a question from this side. This gentleman here in front of you, can just wait for the microphone and please identify yourself. Thanks. It should be working just like that.
Yep.
Thank you.
I have one question and one comment.
If you can just ask the question, please, and reserve the comment till we're over. Thank you.
Well, the comment is somewhat to that. If the question is to eliminate Maduro, I think it's much more complicated than that. But
I think we agree, yeah.
more and more people of importance from Colombia, from Venezuela, from other countries have pointed out that Maduro is illegally in the presidency because he's born in Colombia. And now people come out and they have the data. Why don't you use that and eliminate the problem? That will be 24 hours.
Okay.
Totally.
All right.
And that's not his worst crime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question. Let's see. The lady in front here. Let's go to the front row right here. Thank you. I'm making...
Thank you, Kitty Wang with NTD TV. My question is, without this humanitarian aid being able to deliver to the country, how serious the economy situation is, and how long can they survive? And also, how much we can do to put more sanctions, maybe on the regime, and give them more pressure?
Who would like to? Hector, would you like to try this?
How bad the situation, 87% of Venezuelans live under the poverty line, 60% of them under extreme poverty. In addition, Venezuela is the most unequal country in the hemisphere. Venezuelans go to Cucuta for dialysis and come back. Children go to school in Cucuta and come back. They didn't let them because they haven't been in school for the last 2 weeks because they closed the border. And they go to school. That gives you some sort of an idea. More pressure. The only Latin American country that imposed sanctions on the Maduro cronies, vastly corrupt. I mean, people with bank accounts in their hundreds of millions of dollars all over the world. Andorra, Switzerland, or Panama, you name it. By the way, a corruption that dwarfs Odebrecht.
Oh, yeah.
Dwarfs Odebrecht when you start doing it. It's a corruption that will have to be measured in how many points of GDP. And it's going to be not 1 or 2.
Digits.
Exactly. It's going to be double digits, right? If only Gorin, one case, was $1 billion.
Andrade.
Right? This is, the deal for Odebrecht in New York was 800 million or something like that. Anyway. Well, the only country in Latin America that has imposed sanctions is Panama to those individuals. And again, the Lima Group signed a declaration in May last year, apropos the fraudulent election that Maduro declared himself a winner, and the declaration says that the member countries of the Lima Group will impose sanctions similar to Canada, the U.S., the European Union. And Panama, and they haven't done it yet. I think it's there. That for a start.
John, did you want to follow this up?
Every day that Maduro's in power, life gets worse for the majority of Venezuelans, right? And that will only result in further migration and exacerbate the refugee crisis. And sadly, U.S. sanctions on PDVSA, which the U.S. has imposed with the purpose of exacting change, also will exacerbate those problems.
And I think that over the past week, over the last several days, some administration officials have been talking about the possibility of secondary sanctions, possibility of targeting banks that are dealing with Venezuela, dealing with the Maduro government. And as Hector was mentioning, I think that what's left also for the United States is to track down the money that is held by the Maduro cronies. These are the illicit profits from corruption and doing business with the regime. Now, that being said, saying is a lot easier than finding it. We're going to need cooperation. The United States is going to need a lot of cooperation from Europe on tracing and finding that money. But if we can cut off those flows and cut off the flows of the revenues from narcotics trafficking, those would further isolate the regime.
Gustavo, did you?
Yes, well, I was going to say that if Juan Guaido is the real president of Venezuela, he can order the shipments of oil going to Cuba totally interrupted. And then the U.S. that recognizes Guaido as the true president could blockade any ships going to Cuba with the oil. I mean,
is that a scenario that you see as possible?
If they,
fascinating. That's really interesting. If that hadn't occurred to me.
If they want to be consistent
close to war.
with what they are professing, you know, I am the true president. Order. If and we recognize you, U.S. Well, block them.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
What does the rest of the international community do if that happens? They say, good, we're on board with the U.S. and Guaido. Since we've spoken before, it's been kind of pro forma, it seems, the recognition of Guaido, but does this really make everyone, okay, now everyone has got to get together on this? Would that happen, or what happens?
I think most will applaud.
No, I don't think so, actually. I think
That's what happens.
for a long time, unfortunately, the Cuban government has framed the debate over the embargo as a blockade, which unfortunately all Latin American governments repeat that phrase. It isn't a blockade.
Right.
When we actually impose a blockade, it recalls, obviously, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Right.
I think that would be, you'd watch that, you know, let's hope Guaido becomes a real president soon enough. I think imposing a naval blockade is a prescription for watching our coalition fracture in a very bad way.
Who knows?
I agree with Chris. I think it unnecessarily completely disrupts the narrative that we want.
Okay.
It hasn't been tried.
Well, for a reason, though.
I like this.
Also, it hasn't been tried that we wear underwear on the outside of our pants.
This is a good division on this panel. I'm glad that we've finally gotten to it. This is great. We have time for one more question. Let's have, I think, probably just one more question. Well, actually, let's get these out quickly. We're going to go to 3 questions, and you're just going to ask questions. You're not going to get answered. Okay, we're going to have this woman, this gentleman, and that gentleman. So let's do it like this. Please, again, just a question, not a comment.
Well, I'm also Venezuelan American, and my question also to Gustavo, to any of you, like saying that Guaido is the president and Maduro isn't, and it's also illegal, and he doesn't have any immunity. Why can't, he's already proved that he's in the drugs and all of them, just Dallon and company. Why can't they just, I think everyone would be very happy, including Europe. Why don't they go up after them, considering all the drug, you know, things that they have already under dossier, let's say.
Okay. Well, we'll have that one. This gentleman here, and then that gentleman back there.
Thank you, Johannes Ludwig. I was wondering, what is your take on the U.S. grand strategy in the region? Because almost every member of the U.S. administration, including the president himself at his UN speech 2017, have directly referred to the Monroe Doctrine that had been declared as dead by John Kerry in 2013. Thank you.
Okay, and this gentleman back here.
What was it?
Bernie Cooney, security analyst. How can we break the lock that Cuba seems to have on Venezuelan intelligence and security at the highest level? They apparently have a security guard of Maduro, and that they're controlling the whole intelligence process within Venezuela. How can you break that lock?
Why don't we start with that one first? Who wants to take that one?
Not me.
Chris, how would you like that?
Well, there you see, that one.
Yeah.
Can I go in reverse order? Let me first, actually, I will briefly talk about that.
Okay,
if I had my preference, I'd have the administration talk less about the Monroe Doctrine, because it's a real irritant in the region. Having said that, I understand its value. There is a real issue of nefarious activities by outside actors in the hemisphere that obviously the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 was a bluff to try to prevent. The U.S. didn't have the military capacity to do it. But having said that also, and Jose wrote about this, calling out the so-called troika of tyranny was a good call. I mean, I think we need to call these regimes for what they are, and their sort of links politically, ideologically, as well as financially. But I think we need to recognize that only represents, as Jose had written in Foreign Policy, only represents about 7% of the hemisphere. There's a need, and there's a real lack of representation of U.S. ambassadors, both in Brazil and Mexico. We need to fill that. But having said that, I think the policy has its merits. I just don't like the labeling of it, but that's a personal preference. Let me try to take a shot at how to disarticulate the Cuban security apparatus.
This is good. We're going to have different questions than get different people who give their answers.
Yeah, so I'll just take a crack at that. I think basically, I mean, the Cubans are doing this for money, and they're doing it to meddle with the United States. Meddle is a nice way to say what they're doing with the United States in this. I think we basically do need to force a transition. I don't think they're not going to leave. They're not going to be good brokers in any process. We may be able to get the Chinese if we shame them into changing. We may get the Russians. Cuba's never going to be a good broker in this process because their survival, as John said, depends on this. So there has to be a regime change. And when that happens, you'll see those doctors, the security analysts, the intelligence officers, the sports trainers. I don't know what they're doing there. Sports trainers. They'll all flee back to Cuba. But that's never going to happen unless there's change.
On the Cuba question and how embedded they are in the regime, I think that the best tools we have available to us at the present time are, the military calls them information operations. The State Department calls it public diplomacy. Other people call it propaganda. But it's dedicated messages to the Venezuelan people about the foreign presence that is controlling their destiny. In other words, I think that the United States always had an advantage, for example, during the Cold War, during, for example, the 80s, with all of the support we gave Solidarity in Poland and the non-lethal assistance that we gave them. But what we were building on was an inherent resentment among the people, not only obviously for their own indigenous communist parties, but the idea that their countries, their destinies, their daily lives were being controlled by a foreign power. And I think that those kinds of information operations into Venezuela at this time, building, already working with a negativity towards the Cubans in Venezuela to heighten public dissatisfaction with the Cuban presence.
John, did you want to pick one of those questions to answer?
No.
Hector?
I'm good.
Is there anything?
I agree with Chris on,
Okay.
on the Monroe Doctrine issue and the Roosevelt Corollary and such. And with regards to Cubans in Venezuela, I don't know, and I think if we knew, we would have the United States and other.
Actually,
Gustavo, yes, one of these was directed exactly at you, so why don't we have you have the last word?
no, there is an old Venezuelan saying. It says, la culebra se mata por la cabeza. If you want to kill a snake, you hit it on the head. And the head of the Venezuelan crisis is in Cuba. If we don't take initiatives going for the Cuban government, we'll never really solve the Venezuelan problem.
And just as the last word to that, I think that you're starting to see that in the Trump administration rhetoric surrounding Venezuela. I think we're going to see in the coming weeks more actions directed at Cuba under the rationale of their destructive role in Venezuela.
Well, this is great because you've set us up for a sequel. I'll see you all next month. We'll be talking about Cuba as well as Venezuela. Well, I wanted to thank all of you again for a really fantastic panel. I wanted to thank you all for coming, and thanks to Hudson as well for hosting a wonderful event. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks. That was terrific.